The Christmas Eve Visitor. I've always loved Christmas. There's something magical about it. The twinkling lights, the crispness of winter air, and the way the world seems to slow down. That's why, when my parents decided to spend the holidays abroad, I offered to house-sit their old Victorian home for the week. It was an easy job. Water the plants, collect the mail, and keep the place from looking too empty. But now, as I sit here in the cold, dark living room, my heart racing and my hands trembling, I wish I'd never agreed. It all started 2 nights ago on Christmas Eve. The snowstorm had picked up just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the wind howled like a living thing outside the windows. The house creaked and groaned, the way old houses do, but I told myself it was nothing to worry about. I'd lit a fire in the hearth, wrapped myself in a blanket, and settled in to watch one of those cheesy holiday movies on TV. That's when I first heard it. A soft knock at the front door. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something loose, but the knock came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate raps, as though someone was waiting to be let in. My stomach tightened. It was almost midnight, and the house was at least a mile from the nearest neighbor. Who could possibly be out in this weather? I hesitated, then grabbed my phone and walked cautiously to the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the wind whipping against the house. When I opened the door, no one was there, just a flurry of snow swirling in the darkness. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was probably just kids playing a prank, though the thought didn't sit right. No one would be out in this kind of storm, not even for a joke. I returned to the living room, but the fire seemed dimmer now, the shadows in the corners of the room darker. I turned off the movie, suddenly too aware of how alone I was in this big, empty house. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just faint creaking from upstairs, like footsteps crossing the floor. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving from one room to the next. My chest tightened as I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing through rational explanations. I grabbed the fireplace poker and started up the staircase, each step creaking beneath my weight. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fire downstairs. I checked each room, my pulse pounding in my ears. They were all empty, but as I turned to head back down, I saw it. A single, wet footprint on the wooden floor at the end of the hall. My breath caught in my throat. The footprint was small, as if made by a child, and the water gleamed faintly in the dim light. I hurried back to the living room, my hands shaking as I gripped the poker. The house felt colder now, the warmth of the fire barely touching the air. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. The second knock came at exactly midnight. This time it was louder, more insistent. I didn't move at first, too afraid to even breathe. But then the knocking turned to pounding, a frantic, desperate sound that echoed through the house. Against my better judgment, I crept to the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The pounding stopped. "Let me in," a child's voice whispered. It was faint, almost pleading, but something about it felt wrong. "Who are you?" I asked, my heart hammering. There was no answer, just the soft sound of sobbing from the other side of the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I backed away slowly, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The sobbing continued for what felt like hours, fading into the sound of the storm outside. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me, their presence heavy in the room. When morning finally came, the storm had calmed, and the world outside was blanketed in fresh snow. I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, a trick of my imagination brought on by too much isolation. But when I opened the door to check the front porch, I saw it. Another wet footprint. This one was smeared, as if whoever had made it had dragged their foot through the snow. I spent Christmas Day trying to distract myself. I cooked a big meal, turned on festive music, and called my parents, pretending everything was fine. But as the sun set and the shadows crept back into the house, the sense of unease returned. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard it. The faint sound of a music box playing somewhere upstairs. The melody was hauntingly familiar. A soft, lilting tune that sent chills down my spine. I knew for a fact there was no music box in the house. Gripping the poker once more, I made my way upstairs. The sound grew louder as I approached the guest bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The music box sat on the bed, its lid open, the tiny ballerina spinning in time with the melody. But what made my blood run cold was the photograph propped up next to it. It was an old black and white picture of a family, parents and 2 children, standing in front of the house. One of the children was circled in red ink, her face eerily similar to the little girl in my mother's old Christmas photos. I slammed the lid of the music box shut and ran downstairs, my hands trembling. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my coat and boots, intending to leave immediately. But as I reached the door, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. And then the whisper came again. "Let me in." I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The girl was standing in the hallway, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the fire. Her eyes were black voids, and her smile was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. "You shouldn't have stayed," she said, her voice echoing in the empty house. I ran. I don't even remember grabbing my keys, but the next thing I knew, I was outside, the icy wind biting at my skin as I fumbled to start the car. When the engine finally roared to life, I sped down the driveway, not daring to look back. As I reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark and silent against the snowy backdrop. But just before I turned the corner, I saw her, standing in the window, her black eyes staring after me. I never told my parents what happened. They'd never believe me anyway. But every Christmas, I dream of that house, of the girl with the too wide smile and the empty, black eyes. And every year, I wake up to the faint sound of a music box playing in the distance. The haunting of St. Nicholas Manor. Christmas wasn't supposed to feel this empty. After years of family gatherings filled with laughter, warm meals, and the joy of shared company, this year, I was utterly alone. My parents had moved overseas, my siblings scattered across the country, and my relationship, a 3-year-long heartbreak, had come to a quiet, bitter end last spring. I couldn't stand the idea of sitting alone in my tiny apartment over the holidays. That's how I ended up renting the place. St. Nicholas Manor. The photos in the listing made it look idyllic. A massive Victorian home draped in snow, complete with a turret, old wrought iron gates, and a private forest sprawling behind it. It was tucked deep in the countryside, far from the city's noise and distractions. Perfect for a quiet Christmas, I thought. The rental agent had seemed eager to get the place off his books for the holidays. "No one's rented it in years," he'd said. I didn't question why. The house was even grander in person. Its windows glittered like frost-touched jewels in the late afternoon sun, and the snow blanketing the grounds sparkled with an untouched beauty. But up close, the house had an air of sadness about it. The paint was peeling, the stone steps cracked and uneven. Inside, the air was cold even with the radiators turned on. The faint scent of wood smoke lingered in the halls, as though fires had burned in the hearths not too long ago. But it was the silence that struck me the most. It wasn't the comforting stillness I'd craved. It was oppressive, suffocating. The first day passed uneventfully. I decorated the tree the owner had left behind, stringing it with twinkling lights and hanging ornaments I'd brought from home. As the night settled in, I curled up in the library with a blanket, a mug of hot cocoa, and an old book I'd found on the shelf. The room was dimly lit, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Around midnight, I heard it. Faint footsteps, somewhere upstairs. I froze, listening. They were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. I told myself it was the house settling, the creaks and groans of old wood expanding in the cold. But the sound didn't stop. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and made my way up the grand staircase. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the stained glass window at the end of the corridor. My heart pounded as I checked each room. They were all empty. Back in the library, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside howled against the windows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something, or someone, scratching at my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the longer it went on, the more deliberate it sounded, like fingernails dragging slowly down the wood. I held my breath, clutching the blankets to my chest. This is ridiculous, I thought. You're just spooking yourself. But when the scratching stopped, the knob began to turn. Slowly, quietly. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and flung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air was colder than before, biting against my skin. My breath clouded in the dim light. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. By morning, I was ready to leave, but when I checked my phone to call the rental agent, it was dead. My charger was plugged in, but the outlet seemed to have stopped working. I decided to pack up and drive into town to find help. But when I opened the front door, I stopped in my tracks. The snow was falling hard, thick flakes piling up rapidly. My car, parked at the edge of the driveway, was almost completely buried. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep busy. I started a puzzle, baked cookies, and played old Christmas music on the dusty record player I'd found in the parlor. For a moment, I almost felt normal. The house didn't seem so menacing in the daylight, but as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the unease returned. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, and the wind outside carried a faint, mournful wail. And then the tree lights flickered. At first, I thought it was a power surge, but when the lights blinked back on, they weren't their usual soft yellow. They were red, bright, pulsing red, like tiny drops of blood dripping from the branches. I stood frozen, staring at the tree, my chest tightening with dread. The record player scratched to a halt, and the room was plunged into silence. And then the laughter began. It started as a low chuckle, coming from the hallway. It grew louder, sharper, until it echoed through the house. A child's laughter, high-pitched and eerie. My skin prickled as the sound moved closer, coming from the doorway. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of my heart. And then a whisper, faint but clear. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, but the air was heavy, oppressive. The lights on the tree flickered again, and I swore I saw movement in the reflection of the ornaments. A face, pale and gaunt, staring back at me. The rest of the night was a nightmare. Doors slammed shut on their own. Shadows danced across the walls, and the laughter followed me wherever I went. I tried to leave, but the snowstorm had worsened. The car wouldn't start, and the road was completely impassable. I was trapped. By the time dawn broke, I was a mess. My hands shook as I packed my things, determined to hike to the nearest town if I had to. But as I stepped outside, I stopped dead in my tracks. The snow was untouched. My footprints from the day before were gone, as though I'd never walked there. And my car, buried just the night before, was completely clean. No snow, no frost, just sitting there, waiting. I didn't question it. I climbed in, turned the key, and drove as fast as I could down the winding road, not daring to look back at the house. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I allowed myself to breathe. I pulled over, tears streaming down my face, and called the rental agent. "I need to know," I said, my voice shaking. "What's the story with that house?" There was a long pause on the other end. "You weren't supposed to stay there," he said finally. "We took it off the listings years ago." "Why?" I demanded. "Because every Christmas, it happens again." "What happens?" I whispered. "The family that lived there. They never left." I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw them. A woman in a tattered dress, a man with hollow eyes, and a little girl, her face twisted into a grin that didn't belong to a living child. They were standing in the back seat, and then they were gone. The ghost of Silent Hollow. I should have known better than to spend Christmas alone in a place like Silent Hollow. It was the only rental I could find last minute, an old cabin nestled in the woods, miles from the nearest town. At the time, it seemed perfect. A quiet retreat to clear my head after a messy breakup and a tough year. The thought of no Christmas chaos, no family drama, sounded like bliss. It wasn't until I arrived that the unease began to creep in. The cabin was old, its wooden exterior weathered and cracked from years of neglect. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. Inside, it was sparsely furnished. A worn-out couch, a creaky bed, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The owner had left a small, artificial Christmas tree on the coffee table, its lights flickering weakly, and a handwritten note. "Welcome. Enjoy your stay. Be mindful of the woods at night." That last part gave me pause, but I brushed it off. I wasn't planning to wander into the freezing woods. I locked the door, lit the fireplace, and poured myself a glass of wine. I'd brought a few books and my laptop, thinking I'd spend the night immersed in fiction or watching holiday movies. But the silence was oppressive. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The trees cast long, skeletal shadows on the walls. As the hours ticked by, the sense of isolation began to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone in an unfamiliar place can do that to you. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I climbed into bed, I noticed the small tree on the coffee table. Its lights had stopped flickering and were glowing steadily now, casting a faint, eerie glow across the room. I stared at it for a moment, uneasy, but too tired to dwell on it. I turned off the lamp and pulled the covers over my head. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone walking barefoot on wooden floors. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to convince myself it was just the old cabin settling. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, my body frozen with fear. Then came the knock. Soft, deliberate. Knock! Knock! I wanted to scream, to do anything, but my voice was caught in my throat. I lay there, trembling, until the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, quietly, the door creaked open, and a cold draft filled the room. My eyes were squeezed shut, but I could feel something or someone standing in the doorway. The air was heavy, suffocating. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint and chilling. "Why are you here?" I bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp. When the light flickered on, the room was empty. The door was wide open, but no one was there. My heart was racing as I grabbed my phone, only to find the battery dead. I knew I hadn't forgotten to charge it. I spent the next hour huddled on the couch, the poker from the fireplace clutched in my hand. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that I was just on edge. But the cabin felt different now. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. And then the tree started blinking again. Its lights flickered erratically, faster and faster, until they stopped altogether. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. I stared at the tree, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. A figure reflected in the shiny ornaments. A child standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My chest tightened as I heard the giggle. It was faint, almost playful, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The giggle came again, this time from the kitchen. The sound of small, bare feet echoed on the floorboards. I didn't want to follow it, but I couldn't stay where I was. Clutching the poker, I made my way to the kitchen. It was empty, but the back door was wide open, snow blowing in. My heart sank as I saw the footprints. Small, barefoot prints leading out into the snow. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of there. Grabbing my coat, I headed for the front door, But when I opened it, the world outside was gone. The cabin was surrounded by thick fog, the trees barely visible. I stepped outside, calling for help, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. The air was freezing, each breath like shards of glass in my lungs. And then I saw them, figures moving in the fog, shadows flickering in and out of sight. "Help!" I screamed, but the figures didn't respond. They just stood there, watching. The giggle came again, louder now, echoing all around me. I turned back toward the cabin, but the door was gone. The walls stretched endlessly, the windows dark and empty. Panic set in as I banged on the wood, screaming for someone, anyone, to help me. The giggle turned into laughter, high-pitched and cruel. I spun around, and there she was, a little girl in a white dress, her hair tangled and matted with snow. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her lips twisted into a smile that didn't belong on the face of a child. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. I stumbled back, tripping over something cold and hard. When I looked down, my stomach turned. It was a skeletal hand, jutting out from the snow. Around me, more hands began to emerge, clawing at the ground. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet, but the girl just laughed, the sound piercing and deafening. "You can't leave," she said. "You're one of us now." The world blurred as I ran, my feet sinking into the snow. The fog thickened, the shadows closing in around me. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the laughter, the voices whispering my name. When I finally stopped, I was back at the cabin. The front door was open, the tree inside glowing brightly. I stepped inside, my body numb, and found myself face to face with the girl. She reached out, her icy hand gripping mine. "It's time," she said. The last thing I remember was the cold, the darkness swallowing me whole. They found my car days later, abandoned on the side of the road. The cabin didn't exist, at least not anymore. It had burned down decades ago, taking the lives of a family who lived there. Every Christmas, they say, the ghosts of Silent Hollow wait for someone foolish enough to wander into their trap. And now I'm part of their story. The Ghost of Christmas Hollow. It was Christmas Eve and I was alone. Not by choice, but because my plans had unraveled at the last minute. A snowstorm had swept through the town, and the roads to my parents' house were impassable. I was stuck in my small rental house at the edge of Hollow Creek, a place with a dark history I had tried to ignore ever since I moved in. I told myself it would be fine. A quiet night in wouldn't kill me, right? I had a bottle of wine, some leftover takeout, and a stack of unread books. But the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, an uneasy silence settled over the house. The storm outside intensified. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling the windows. Snow fell in thick sheets, coating the world in a suffocating white blanket. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle. A faint creak upstairs, the sound of something brushing against the walls. I told myself it was just the wind. This old house was full of quirks, after all. But then, as I reached for my wine glass, I saw it. A single, wet footprint on the wooden floor. My heart stopped. The footprint was small, almost childlike, and pointed toward the living room. But I hadn't gone outside, and there was no way snow could have melted into the shape of a footprint. I stared at it, waiting for logic to kick in, for some rational explanation to present itself. But none came. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The word echoed back, swallowed by the storm outside. I grabbed the fireplace poker and edged toward the living room. The lights flickered as I entered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. I scanned the room, my breath shallow, but it was empty. Nothing was out of place. I was about to convince myself I was imagining things when I heard it. A giggle, high-pitched and echoing, like a child playing hide and seek. My stomach twisted into knots. "Who's there?" I demanded, clutching the poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. The giggle came again, this time from the kitchen. I turned and saw a flash of movement, a blur of white darting past the doorway. I rushed into the kitchen, the poker raised. "This isn't funny," I shouted. The room was empty, but the back door was ajar, snow blowing in. I hadn't opened it. Then I saw them. More footprints, leading from the door to the stairs. Small, wet prints, as though a barefoot child had wandered in from the storm. My pulse thundered in my ears as I followed the trail. The staircase groaned beneath my weight as I climbed, every step sending chills down my spine. The air grew colder the higher I went, my breath visible in the dim light. The footprints led to the door of the guest bedroom, the one I never used. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run out into the storm and never look back. But something compelled me to keep going. I reached the door and pushed it open, my hand shaking. The room was empty, save for the old rocking chair in the corner. It had come with the house, a relic of its previous owners. I had always found it unsettling, with its worn wood and faded upholstery, but I never had the heart to get rid of it. Now it creaked back and forth, as though someone had just risen from it. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words barely audible. And then I saw her. She stood by the window, a small figure in a tattered white dress. Her hair was long and matted, her skin pale as the snow outside. She turned to face me, and my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were hollow sockets, black as night, and her lips twisted into a smile that didn't belong on the face of a child. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her voice soft and lilting, like a song carried on the wind. I stumbled back, my mind screaming that this couldn't be real. But the room grew colder, the walls closing in around me. The girl stepped forward, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. "I'm lonely," she said, tilting her head. "They always leave me. Will you stay?" I turned and bolted, my feet barely touching the stairs as I raced down. The air felt heavy, like I was wading through water, but I didn't stop. The giggles followed me, echoing through the house. I burst into the living room, grabbing my coat and keys, ready to flee into the storm. But the front door wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, but it was as if the door had fused to the frame. The windows were covered in frost, the outside world a swirling void of white. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, and behind it, I saw her. She was standing in the hallway, watching me, her head tilted unnaturally, her smile widening. "You can't leave," she said. "You promised to stay." "I didn't promise anything," I shouted, spinning around to face her. But the hallway was empty. The air crackled with static, the lights flickering violently. Then I heard the rocking chair, creaked rhythmically, the sound filling the house. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. The girl was sitting in it now, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You're mine now," she whispered. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the snow outside the house, the storm having passed. The sun was rising, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. My car was parked where I had left it, the doors unlocked. I didn't go back inside. Couldn't. Instead, I drove straight to the nearest motel, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. When I finally stopped, I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot, but it was what I saw on my wrist that made my stomach drop. A small, wet handprint. I've tried to move on, but the dreams won't stop. Every night I hear her giggle. I see the rocking chair, and I feel her icy breath on my neck as she whispers, "You promised." I've researched the house since then, learning about the family who lived there decades ago. A little girl drowned in the creek on Christmas Eve, her body never found. They say she haunts the house, waiting for someone to play with her. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know this. Once you let her in, she never lets you go.